Please wake up, please. Theodore Sinclair, a billionaire haunted by loneliness, pleads as he pours water into the mouth of Ebony Washington. A black woman collapsed on a park bench, her triplets nestled in a tattered stroller beside her. In the heart of a Chicago dawn, this desperate moment sparks a story of compassion, resilience, and unexpected love. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments and let us know what you think will happen next. Will Theodore's act of kindness change lives? Or will shadows from Ebony's past threaten everything? This gripping tale unfolds with twists that will keep you guessing. Subscribe to our channel for the latest stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, and join our community by telling us your city or country. What secrets lie behind Ebony's struggle, and how far will Theodore go to help her? The crisp dawn air in Lincoln Park, Chicago, carried a faint chill that whispered through the leaves of ancient oaks, stirring the world awake with reluctant grace. Joggers pounded the winding paths, their breaths puffing like smoke in the early light, while distant traffic hummed like a city's restless heartbeat. Amid this serene tableau of urban escape, a tragedy unfolded in silence. Ebony Washington, a 32-year-old black woman with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that once sparkled with unyielding hope, slumped lifelessly on a weathered bench. Her body, frail and battered by months of unrelenting hardship, had finally betrayed her. Clutched in her limp arms was a tattered stroller, its frame rusted and wheels wobbling from overuse. Inside, nestled under a threadbare blanket stained with the remnants of desperate survival, were her triplets, Jamal, Isha, and Zara, barely 6 months old. Their tiny faces, usually alight with innocent curiosity, were now pale and drawn, their movements sluggish, lips cracked from dehydration. Ebony's clothes hung loosely on her emaciated frame, faded jeans patched with duct tape, a hoodie frayed at the cuffs, testaments to nights spent in shelters, days begging for scraps, and endless walks through indifferent streets. She had fought tooth and nail to keep them alive, scavenging formula from food banks, shielding them from the cold with her body heat. But exhaustion had claimed her, pulling her into a void where dreams of better days flickered like dying embers. Not far away, Theodore Sinclair pounded the pavement in his ritual morning run, his expensive sneakers striking the ground with mechanical precision. At 42, the tech billionaire was a man sculpted by success and shadowed by solitude. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, his sharp blue eyes hidden behind a veil of perpetual fatigue. He had built an empire from code and algorithms, revolutionizing artificial intelligence with innovations that powered global corporations. Yet his penthouse in the heart of the city felt like a gilded cage, empty, echoing with the ghosts of a failed marriage. His ex-wife had left years ago, her parting words still echoing. "You're married to your machines, Theo, not to me." Since then, he had armored himself in routine, board meetings, late-night coding sessions, and these solitary runs that offered fleeting escape from the void within. The park was his sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos faded into the rhythm of his breath and footsteps. But today, as he rounded a bend near the southeastern grove, something shattered that illusion. His eyes caught the anomaly first, a crooked stroller abandoned like a relic, a small cap dangling from its handle. Then the woman slumped sideways, her head lolling unnaturally, dark curls cascading over her face like a curtain of despair. Theodore slowed, his heart skipping a beat. "Hey," he called softly, approaching with caution. No response. The air grew thick with urgency as he knelt beside her. Her skin was clammy, her pulse faint under his fingers. Panic surged through him like electricity. Glancing into the stroller, he saw the babies, 3 tiny forms bundled together, their chests rising in shallow, labored breaths. One whimpered weakly, a sound so fragile it pierced his soul. "Oh, God," he muttered, scanning the empty path. No one nearby, no help in sight. Instinct kicked in. He fumbled for his water bottle, unscrewing the cap with trembling hands. Gently tilting Ebony's head back, he poured a trickle into her parted lips. "Please wake up, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking with raw desperation. The water dribbled down her chin, but she didn't stir. Time stretched taut, every second a potential thief of life. He could call 911, should call 911, but visions of ambulances delayed by traffic, of bureaucratic waits in a system overburdened and indifferent, flashed through his mind. These lives hung by a thread. Minutes could mean everything. No, he couldn't risk it. His SUV was parked just beyond the trees, a sleek black beast equipped with everything short of a medical bay. Decision made, Theodore acted. With surprising tenderness for a man unaccustomed to such intimacy, he scooped Ebony into his arms. She was frighteningly light, her body limp against his chest, head resting on his shoulder as if seeking refuge in unconsciousness. Her scent, faint soap mixed with the earthy tang of survival, filled his nostrils, grounding him in the reality of her plight. Balancing her carefully, he gripped the stroller's handle with one hand, wheeling it awkwardly along the uneven path. The front wheel jammed twice on roots, nearly toppling the precious cargo, but he steadied it, muscles straining under the dual burden. The baby stirred faintly, one letting out a thin cry that echoed his inner turmoil. "Hold on, little ones," he whispered, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. "I've got you." Reaching the parking lot felt like an eternity, the sun climbing higher as if mocking his haste. He fumbled with the keys, unlocking the SUV with a beep that shattered the morning quiet. First the stroller. He folded it with practiced efficiency, though he'd never handled one before, securing the babies in the back seat with improvised straps from his gym bag. They looked so vulnerable there, tiny islands in a sea of leather luxury. Then Ebony. He eased her into the passenger seat, buckling her in, her head lolling gently against the headrest. As he slid into the driver's seat, engine roaring to life, Theodore glanced in the rearview mirror. The park receded behind him, a green blur giving way to city streets. His mind raced ahead to the mansion on the outskirts. Maria would be there, Dr. Ramirez a phone call away. For the first time in years, Theodore Sinclair felt alive, propelled not by ambition or code, but by a primal urge to save what fate had placed in his path. The road ahead blurred with possibility and peril, but in that moment, he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back. Theodore's heart raced as he carefully maneuvered the SUV, the hum of the engine, and the distant echo of his footsteps being the only sounds in the otherwise silent night. Ebony was still unconscious in the passenger seat, her face pale and drawn, a look of someone who had been starved not just by food, but by life itself. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the three babies in the back, their small, fragile bodies still limp from exhaustion, their tiny mouths parted slightly as though waiting for something, anything, to revive them from the depths of their misery. Theodore had no idea how long it would take for them to recover, but he did not doubt that they were teetering on the edge of something worse, something irreversible. Every mile he drove away from the city felt like an eternity, a race against time. His thoughts were jumbled, a mix of dread and determination. But one thing remained clear. He was not going to let them die in his care, not on his watch. When the gates of his estate finally loomed ahead, Theodore felt a wave of relief wash over him. The house, with its towering facade and cold elegance, stood like a fortress against the chaos of the world, offering sanctuary not just to him, but to them. He parked the car near the entrance, taking care to keep the engine running, the warmth of the heater beginning to rise and seep into the cold air of the car. It seemed like a small comfort, but it was enough for now. He opened the door and hurried to Ebony's side, pulling her out of the SUV with surprising tenderness, given the urgency of the moment. The weight of her frailty struck him hard as he cradled her in his arms, feeling the delicate structure of her body, the lightness of someone who had been starved not just of food, but of care, of love. With a grim determination, he carried her toward the front door, each step heavier than the last. Inside, the house was lit only by the faint glow of overhead lights. Theodore had never been one for excessive decoration, preferring the minimalist look of the space to the cluttered chaos of too many possessions. But tonight, the sterile, immaculate interior felt almost suffocating. He called out for Maria, his housekeeper, his voice sharp with a mix of anxiety and command. "Maria, help me! Quickly!" A moment later she appeared, her face instantly registering the gravity of the situation. She rushed over, her eyes wide with concern as she followed Theodore's gaze to the three children, still in their car seats, barely stirring. "Dr. Ramirez is on his way," she said, already grabbing a blanket from the couch to wrap around one of the babies. Theodore nodded but didn't speak. He was too focused on Ebony, whose breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. He didn't know what to do first. He was no doctor, no healer. But he did know one thing. He needed to get her the help she needed, and fast. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway moments later, and soon the door to his study opened, revealing Dr. Ramirez, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a practiced calmness that seemed to settle the room. Theodore stepped aside as the doctor quickly approached Ebony, his eyes scanning her face, checking for signs of life. "What happened?" Dr. Ramirez asked, his tone even, though his eyes flicked quickly to the three children, noting their condition. "She collapsed in the park," Theodore said, his voice tight. "She was, I think she's malnourished. Her kids, too. They're barely moving." Dr. Ramirez didn't respond immediately, his hands moving over Ebony's body in a professional routine. He placed his fingers against her wrist, then moved to her throat, checking her pulse. His eyes narrowed as he gently lifted one of Ebony's eyelids, studying her pupils. Theodore watched, anxious, as the doctor's face remained neutral, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Ramirez spoke. "Severe dehydration, nutritional deficiencies. She needs intravenous fluids immediately, and we must start rehydrating the babies right away." Maria, hearing the words, began moving in a flurry of action. She disappeared into the kitchen, preparing the supplies as directed. Theodore was left standing there, the weight of the moment settling on him like a thick fog. His gaze flicked back to Ebony, now unconscious, her chest rising and falling with each faint breath. A strange, almost parental protectiveness washed over him, something he hadn't felt in years. He hadn't been this close to another person since his ex-wife had left him, taking everything with her, her presence, her warmth, her love. He had been left with only the cold, empty space that now felt so much more suffocating as he watched the woman before him, so fragile, so broken, fighting to survive. There was no doubt that she was fighting, just as her children were. But the fight felt futile without the proper resources, without the right care, without love. The doctor moved quickly, directing Maria to assist him in setting up the IV line for Ebony. Theodore stood by, watching them work in silence, unable to do anything but wait. The only sounds were the soft beeping of the monitors and the low murmur of the doctor's voice as he spoke to Maria in Spanish, giving instructions. Theodore wasn't sure how long it had been when he finally noticed the babies again, their small forms still, their eyes barely open. He walked over slowly, crouching down to their level. The sight of their tiny, fragile faces, their lips cracked and dry, brought a sharp pang to his chest. They had not even had a chance to live. He reached out, gently brushing the back of his fingers against one of their small hands, as if trying to offer some comfort, some reassurance. "You'll be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Perhaps to them, perhaps to himself. The evening stretched on as Dr. Ramirez and Maria worked tirelessly. Ebony's condition improved slowly, and the babies began to show signs of life, their eyes fluttering, their movements becoming less sluggish. Theodore watched it all, unable to shake the nagging feeling that, for all the money in the world, none of it mattered when someone was suffering. In that moment, all that mattered was the pulse of life, the breath in her chest, the fragile hope that they could pull through. And just as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Theodore felt a strange sense of relief. Not because everything was fixed, but because they were still alive. They were still here. And for now, that was enough. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft beeping of the monitors that stood like sentinels beside the couch where Ebony lay. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, as if emerging from a fog, and the first thing she saw was the unfamiliar gleaming white ceiling above her, a stark contrast to the dingy, dim-lit rooms she had known. For a moment, her mind was a blank canvas, her thoughts sluggish, struggling to find focus. She tried to sit up, her body weak and uncooperative, and a faint groan escaped her lips as the coldness of the room seeped into her bones. Panic began to rise in her chest, and she reached out instinctively, her hands trembling as they sought out the familiar weight of her children. Jamal, Aisha, Zara, she murmured, her voice cracked and dry. Her breath quickened in her panic, and she began to struggle against the sheets that tangled around her legs. But before she could rise, a steady, reassuring voice broke through the haze. Easy now. Theodore's voice was calm, but firm, his footsteps approaching quietly from across the room. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her back down. They're right here, he said, his tone warm with a sincerity that almost startled her. They're safe. She turned her head toward the direction he pointed, her heart still pounding, her eyes darting between the nannies and the small cribs set up near the wall. Her children lay there, their tiny forms curled up in the soft blankets, breathing peacefully. It took a few seconds for the relief to wash over her. She hadn't even realized how desperately she had been holding her breath. Despite the comfort of seeing her children unharmed, Ebony's mind was still reeling, the fog of confusion clinging to her thoughts. "Where am I?" she asked hoarsely, her voice barely above a whisper, and then she immediately regretted it, fearing the answer. She had no memory of how she had ended up here, or why Theodore Sinclair, a man she had never met before, was standing over her like some guardian angel, a man so far removed from her world that his very presence felt like a dream. Theodore hesitated, his gaze faltering as if unsure of how to phrase it. "You're at my house," he finally said, his eyes softening as he leaned against the wall. "I found you in the park. You collapsed." Ebony's brow furrowed as the pieces began to slowly fall into place. The park, the old bench, the cold air, the crushing weight of exhaustion, it all flooded back in an overwhelming wave. Her chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer weight of everything she had lost. I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of guilt and pride. The kind of pride that comes from a mother who had fought to the bitter end to hold on to her children. She wanted to say more, to explain her desperation, but the words felt foreign in her mouth, as if the experience had stripped her of the language she had once known. Theodore gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You didn't cause trouble," he replied gently. "You're safe now, and that's what matters." His words, though kind, felt like an invitation to let go, to release the burden she had carried alone for so long. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ebony let herself close her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace. The weight on her chest lifted, just a fraction, but then her thoughts returned to the unshakable reality she had left behind. "My husband, Marcus," she whispered, the pain in her voice sharp and raw, like a wound that had never healed. Theodore's expression softened, and he took a seat beside her on the couch, careful not to crowd her space. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice full of understanding. He didn't need to ask more. She had told him everything when he had first brought her here, how Marcus had died in a car accident just before she had found out she was pregnant, how the world had shattered around her, how she had become a ghost in her own life, drifting from one shelter to the next, holding on to the thin threads of survival. Ebony's eyes filled with tears again, but she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to show weakness. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "How do you keep going when everything is falling apart?" Theodore's gaze was unwavering, his eyes fixed on her with a depth that felt almost too intimate, too revealing. He knew the feeling well, had known it for years. After his divorce, after the failure of his marriage, he had felt the same emptiness clawing at him, the same question echoing in his mind. "How do you keep going when your world collapses?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over, as though testing the waters, and placed a hand on her arm. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he said quietly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He could see the skepticism in her eyes, the wariness that had been cultivated by years of hardship. He didn't expect her to trust him instantly, but he couldn't help but offer her the same hand that had once been extended to him. "We all need help sometimes. It doesn't make us weak." Ebony looked down at his hand, feeling the warmth radiating from it. The gesture was simple, but it struck her with an intensity that left her breathless. For a long time, she had believed that to survive, she had to do it all on her own, that asking for help was a sign of failure, a surrender. But here, in this strange house, with a man she barely knew, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet understanding that passed between them without words. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion that had stripped her of the armor she'd worn for so long. She closed her eyes again, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without fear, without guilt, without the weight of the world pressing down on her. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," she said softly, her voice shaky but firm. "But I'll try. For them. For my kids." Theodore nodded, his eyes soft with something close to admiration. "That's all anyone can do. Try." His voice was steady, grounded, as though he had walked this path before. And in that moment, Ebony realized that perhaps they were not so different after all, two lost souls caught in the same storm, both looking for a way out. The room was still, but it was no longer oppressive. The weight of uncertainty was still there, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable mountain. It felt more like a road they could walk together, slowly, cautiously, but together. The first few days in Theodore's grand house felt like living inside a gilded cage. Ebony had never been one for luxury, and the opulence of the mansion was, at first, more suffocating than comforting. The polished marble floors, the endless hallways, the towering ceilings, all of it felt so distant from the world she had known, where survival was a daily battle fought in cramped shelters or abandoned buildings. Even as she recovered physically, regaining some strength after the care Dr. Ramirez had provided, there was an unease that clung to her. She hadn't asked for this help. She had never wanted to be anyone's charity case, and yet here she was, living in a place that felt like a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. Theodore had made it clear that he expected nothing in return for taking them in. No promises, no debts to be repaid. But Ebony couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was being watched, judged, even if only by her conscience. Theodore had been patient with her, though. He never pressed her to talk about her past, never demanded gratitude for his help. His gestures were always quiet, thoughtful, from leaving a basket of fresh fruit on the counter to offering her a soft smile when their eyes met. It was the little things that kept her from leaving. She had considered it, more than once, the temptation to pack up her children and leave this lavish prison. But each time she looked at them, their tiny faces so fragile, so vulnerable, she stayed. She would never abandon them, not again. Still, she wasn't ready to accept Theodore's help entirely. Not yet. She had to regain some control over her life, and the idea of depending on someone else, especially a man like Theodore Sinclair, felt like swallowing a bitter pill she wasn't sure she could swallow. One morning, as the sun cast soft beams through the windows of the sprawling kitchen, Maria, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with a warm smile. "I thought you might want to help me with the children today," Maria said, her voice gentle but full of purpose. "The babies are napping, but I could use a hand with their things, and I could use your help with some organizing." Ebony had grown accustomed to the quiet routine of the house, the delicate tinkling of the chandelier above the dining table, the soft swish of Maria's apron as she moved through the kitchen. But there was always a sense of distance, a quiet boundary that Ebony hadn't crossed. She wasn't a guest here. She wasn't a charity case either. She was just lost, caught between a past that haunted her and a future she couldn't grasp. At first, Ebony had been reluctant to accept Maria's offer, but the warmth in the woman's eyes and the soft insistence in her voice made her reconsider. It wasn't much, just a simple task: folding laundry, organizing the children's toys, tidying up the room where the babies slept. But it was something. It was action. And more importantly, it was a small way for Ebony to feel like she had a purpose again. She hesitated for a moment, looking at the floor beneath her feet, as if searching for some sign that this small effort would mean something. With a deep breath, she finally nodded and followed Maria into the room. Maria handed her a pile of clothes and a basket of toys, and together they worked in silence. Ebony's hands moved automatically, folding the soft cotton shirts, stacking the little blocks with an attention to detail that almost startled her. She hadn't realized how much she missed the feeling of control, the sense of normalcy that came from taking care of her children's things, from preparing their world in the only way she knew how. The steady rhythm of folding, sorting, and arranging was meditative, a small balm for the aching parts of her soul. The hours passed, the house quiet except for the occasional sound of Maria humming to herself as she worked. Ebony didn't speak much, but there was a comfort in the silence, a shared understanding that needed no words. She noticed, though, that Maria seemed to be giving her more than just tasks to keep her occupied. The older woman was teaching her, in small ways, how to navigate the strange new life, how to reclaim some semblance of dignity without surrendering to pity. Maria didn't talk down to her, didn't treat her like a charity case, and that was perhaps the most healing thing Ebony had felt in a long time. She wasn't a burden to be carried. She wasn't something broken to be fixed. She was just human. She could still contribute. She could still be useful. Later, as the day wore on, Theodore appeared in the doorway, a faint smile on his lips as he surveyed the room. "Looks like we've got a professional in here," he remarked, his voice light but sincere. "I knew you'd find your footing." Ebony glanced up, meeting his gaze for a moment before looking away. His praise, though simple, stirred something in her chest. She hadn't expected it, didn't want to need it, but his words meant more than she cared to admit. It wasn't about the work, it wasn't about the house, it was about the recognition, the acknowledgement that she was still capable of something. And for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a spark of pride ignite within her. "I'm just doing what I can," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet defiance. "I don't want to feel like I'm just taking up space." Theodore tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. He could sense the walls she had built around herself, the armor she wore to protect her fragile sense of self. He knew it wasn't about charity for her. It was about dignity, the ability to stand on her own, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "I understand," he said, his tone serious now, "and I'm not going to ask you to do anything you're not comfortable with, but just know that here, you don't have to do it all alone." He paused for a moment, his gaze flickering to the babies, who were now peacefully asleep in their cribs. "I'm here if you need help. Always." Ebony didn't respond immediately. She didn't know how to respond. The offer was simple enough, but it was too complicated for her to process all at once. She wasn't used to being helped, not like this. The thought of relying on anyone else was foreign to her, something that made her feel weak. Yet as she stood there in the quiet of the room, the scent of fresh laundry and the soft lull of the baby's breathing filling the space, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could accept this. She could accept help without losing herself in the process. It wasn't surrender, it wasn't weakness, it was just a step forward. Later that evening, as the house settled into its rhythm, Theodore offered her something more, a chance to regain a part of herself she had long lost. "If you're interested," he said, his voice casual, but there was something more behind his words, and something deeper. "I can help you get back into teaching. There's a program for online certification that might work for you." Ebony froze for a moment, her mind racing. Teaching. It had been a lifetime ago, or so it felt. But the idea of stepping back into a classroom, of reclaiming a piece of the life she had once known, stirred something within her. "I'll think about it," she replied, her voice quiet, but there was an unmistakable shift in her tone. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. It was an ordinary morning, the kind where the sunlight trickled through the curtains in soft beams, and the house felt calm, almost peaceful. Maria had already begun her routine in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread filling the air, and the soft cries of the babies were a comforting background sound. But as Theodore stood in the living room, sipping his coffee and watching the morning light dance on the floor, he felt something shift in the air, an unsettling tension that seemed to hang around the edges of the house. Ebony was sitting on the couch nearby, the weight of the day ahead heavy on her shoulders, her mind still consumed by thoughts of the future and the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. But as she glanced toward the window, Her gaze hardened, and Theodore could see the change in her posture, the stiffening of her body as if she had sensed something lurking just beyond the horizon. Before he could ask her what was wrong, the sound of a car pulling up outside shattered the calm. Ebony's eyes widened, and she stood up abruptly, her hands shaking slightly. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Theodore frowned, glancing toward the window where the black sedan had parked in front of the driveway, its engine still idling. He didn't recognize the car, and yet the tension in the air was palpable. Ebony's face had gone pale, and her hands, which had once been steady as she cared for the children, were now trembling in a way that sent a chill down Theodore's spine. "That's Raymond," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but her words cut through the air like a knife. Theodore froze, the name unfamiliar, but carrying a weight that felt ominous. He could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way her body seemed to retreat into itself, as if bracing for an attack. He had seen this before, the way trauma could haunt a person, lingering in the corners of their mind, resurfacing when they least expected it. "He's my brother-in-law," Ebony continued, her voice shaking now. He wants to take my children." Theodore's heart sank as he processed her words. This wasn't just a visit, it was a confrontation with someone who held the power to destroy the fragile life Ebony had started to rebuild. Without thinking, Theodore set his coffee cup down and moved toward her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Ebony nodded, her face pale and taut with fear. "He's always wanted them," she said, her voice thick with the weight of old wounds. "Ever since Marcus died, he's been waiting for an opportunity. I don't trust him." Theodore didn't hesitate. He could see the way this man, Raymond, was already casting a shadow over their peace. He knew that if Ebony was afraid, if she feared for her children, then it was his responsibility to protect them. "We'll handle this," Theodore said, his voice firm, but not without a trace of something else. A protective instinct, a deep sense of duty. "I'll make sure he doesn't take them." Ebony turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I'm not sure I can fight him, Theodore. I'm not sure I can keep them safe." There was a rawness in her voice, a vulnerability that struck Theodore more than he had anticipated. He wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone anymore, that he would help her, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her or the children. But instead, he simply nodded and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to fight him alone," he said, his words a quiet promise. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Raymond approached the front door, and Ebony stiffened, her fear palpable. Theodore's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. He had no idea what kind of man Raymond was, but he would not let this person threaten Ebony or her children. When the doorbell rang, Ebony's hand tightened on the armrest of the couch, her knuckles white. Theodore took a deep breath and moved toward the door, his steps deliberate and calm, though his pulse raced in his ears. When he opened the door, Raymond was standing there, his expression smug, his eyes cold and calculating. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit that spoke of wealth and power, a stark contrast to the vulnerable woman he had come to claim. "I'm here for my nieces and nephews," Raymond said, his tone curt, as if there were no question in his mind that he had the right to take them. "Ebony is unfit to raise them. She can barely take care of herself, let alone 3 children." Theodore's eyes narrowed at the accusation, but he didn't let it show. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway, and stood his ground. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Theodore replied, his voice calm but firm. "Ebony is not unfit, and you're not taking her children." Raymond scoffed, his lip curling in disdain. "You think you can stop me? Do you think you have any say in this? I'm their family." Theodore's gaze hardened, the tension in the air thickening with every word that was spoken. "You may be their family, but you don't get to decide what's best for them. Not when you've never been around, not when you've shown no interest in them until now." The silence between them stretched, a battle of wills. Raymond's eyes flickered with something dark, something dangerous, but he didn't move. "I don't want any trouble," he said, though the sneer on his face said otherwise. "But I'll do whatever it takes to make sure those kids are taken care of." Before Theodore could respond, Maria appeared in the hallway, her presence a quiet but firm reminder that she too was part of this home now. She stood by the door, her arms crossed, her expression resolute. "Raymond," she said, her voice steady but filled with authority, "you are not welcome here. And if you continue to threaten this family, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." Raymond's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment it looked like he might argue. But something in Maria's stance, something in her calm defiance made him pause. He glared at Theodore one last time, his jaw clenched in frustration, before turning on his heel and storming off toward his car. The tension in the house didn't dissipate immediately, though. Ebony's shoulders sagged in relief, but the fear still lingered in her eyes, and Theodore could see that the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the sound of Raymond's car faded into the distance, Theodore turned to Ebony, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to worry about him anymore," he said. "We'll take care of this, I promise." Ebony's gaze softened, her eyes filling with tears that she hadn't allowed herself to shed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And for the first time, Theodore realized that she wasn't just thanking him for the protection. She was thanking him for the hope he had given her, for the reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. The days that followed Raymond's departure were quieter, but the tension that had gripped the house hadn't fully dissipated. Ebony still woke up with a sense of unease, a lingering fear that her past would catch up with her at any moment, and that somehow it would all slip through her fingers. Theodore could see the way she carried herself. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if she were bracing for something, for the inevitable. He couldn't blame her. She had spent so much of her life running from one disaster to another that even peace seemed like a foreign concept. But he could also see that something was changing in her, something small but significant. She wasn't the broken woman who had arrived at his doorstep anymore. There was a flicker of resilience in her eyes, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. And though she still hesitated to fully embrace the help he offered, there was an unspoken shift between them, a growing trust that neither of them dared to put into words. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, painting the walls of the house with warm hues of orange and gold, Theodore found Ebony sitting in the garden. She was on the bench beneath the oak tree, her hands resting lightly in her lap, staring out at the horizon. The sight of her there, so still and yet so distant, stirred something in him. He had grown used to her presence in the house, to the way she moved through his world with quiet determination. But there were still moments when the weight of her past seemed to hang around her like a shadow. He had noticed it more lately, the way she would sometimes retreat into herself, withdrawing from the everyday life that she had begun to build with him and the children. He stepped outside and approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her, but also knowing that the moment had come. She needed to decide to take the next step, and he wasn't going to let her do it alone. As he neared, Ebony turned her head toward him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How are the babies?" she asked, her voice soft, but there was an underlying weariness in it that he couldn't ignore. "They're good. Maria just finished feeding them. They're napping now." Theodore paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them before continuing. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, Ebony." Her eyes flickered away, as if she were trying to hide the truth, but Theodore could see through it. He had learned to read the subtle signs, the small gestures that spoke louder than words. She was struggling, still, and as much as she tried to protect herself, the cracks were beginning to show. "It's just a lot," she said finally, her voice tight, as though she were trying to keep her emotions in check. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to fix everything, how to make it right." Theodore sat down next to her, not too close but close enough that she would feel his presence. He didn't rush to offer a solution, didn't try to fix it with the kind of practicality that had always been his go-to response in the past. Instead, he simply sat in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. He knew she wasn't asking for answers, at least not yet. She was asking for space to breathe, for permission to feel the enormity of what had happened, what she had been through. And for the first time, Theodore realized just how much she had buried beneath the surface. "You don't have to fix it all at once," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay not to have all the answers right now. but I can help you find them if you want. Ebony's gaze dropped to the ground, her fingers curling slightly as she gripped the edges of the bench. It wasn't the first time she had heard him say something like that, but for some reason, this time, it felt different. His voice was sincere, a promise that went beyond the surface. And maybe for the first time since Marcus had died, Ebony felt the stirrings of something that had been long buried. Hope. "I've never really had anyone help me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." Theodore turned slightly to face her, his gaze steady. "I know," he said simply, "but you're not alone anymore." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It wasn't the grand gesture of reassurance that she had expected, but something about his quiet presence, his willingness to simply be there with her, made it feel real. The weight of the past, the fear that had always kept her on edge, was still there, but it didn't feel as overwhelming as it once had. She wasn't ready to fully accept it, not yet, but she was beginning to understand something important. She didn't have to do this alone. Later that night, as the house grew quiet and the children settled into their beds, Theodore came to find her again. She was sitting by the window in her room, looking out into the darkened night, the soft moonlight casting shadows on her face. She didn't hear him approach, but when he spoke, his voice was low and gentle like the evening air. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said, about teaching again." Ebony didn't turn to face him, but she felt the weight of his words settle around her. "I don't know if I can do it," she said, her voice tight. "I've been out of it for so long. I don't even know if I'm good enough anymore." Theodore's voice was unwavering. "You're more than good enough, Ebony. And this isn't about being perfect. It's about getting back to something you love, something that's always been a part of who you are. It's a chance for you to find your footing again, to take control of your future." Ebony felt her throat tighten, and she fought back the tears that threatened to surface. She hadn't realized just how much she had missed teaching, how much a part of her it had always been, until now. The idea of stepping back into a classroom, of being a teacher again, felt like a distant dream. But hearing Theodore's words, feeling the belief he had in her, it made that dream feel closer, more possible. "You don't have to decide right now," Theodore added softly. "Just think about it. You've come so far, Ebony. I know you can do this." She turned to face him then, her eyes searching his, looking for the truth in his words. And in that moment, she realized that Theodore wasn't just offering her a chance to rebuild her career. He was offering her a chance to rebuild her life. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her past lift, if only just a little. She wasn't sure how the road ahead would unfold, but for the first time, she felt like she was walking it with someone who believed in her, and maybe that was enough to start anew. The garden had become a sanctuary of sorts for them, a place where the chaos of the world could fade into the background, and for a few moments they could just exist quietly, peacefully, together. Theodore had noticed the way Ebony's eyes softened when she stepped into the garden, the way she seemed to breathe easier, as if the weight of her struggles momentarily lifted with each step she took among the flowers and vines. He had watched her from a distance as she tended to the small plants she had started growing, taking care of them with a gentle touch that mirrored the care she was beginning to give herself. There was something beautiful in that, something almost fragile, like a bud opening up after a long winter, and it made Theodore realize just how much she had hidden from the world, how much she had held back out of fear of being hurt again. On this evening, the sky was painted with the soft hues of twilight, the air crisp and cool. Ebony was sitting on the bench beneath the old oak tree, her gaze distant but not absent, as if she were lost in thought but not entirely alone with it. Theodore stood in the doorway watching her, his mind racing with emotions he had tried to keep at bay for so long. Over the past few weeks, he had felt an undeniable shift between them, something that went beyond friendship, beyond the quiet understanding they had built together. The way she smiled at him when their eyes met, the way her laughter sounded like music to his ears, the way his chest tightened whenever she was near. It was impossible to ignore. But he had also seen the wall she had built, the hesitance in her eyes whenever he crossed that invisible line between being her protector and something more. She had been through so much, and he understood the hesitation, the fear of opening up again, of letting someone into a heart that had been shattered and mended too many times. Still, the pull between them was there, and it was undeniable. He had no intention of rushing her, but tonight he couldn't deny the yearning inside him any longer. He stepped outside, his footsteps quiet on the gravel path, the sound of his approach breaking the stillness of the moment. Ebony's head turned slightly as she heard him, her eyes softening as they met his. She offered a small, almost hesitant smile, one that still carried a trace of uncertainty. "The babies are asleep," she asked, her voice a gentle murmur that seemed to match the mood of the evening. "They are," Theodore replied, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something more. He hesitated for a moment before continuing, knowing this wasn't a conversation that could be rushed. "Maria and the others are keeping an eye on them. I thought I'd come out here, spend some time with you." Ebony shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the bench, the gesture subtle but telling. She didn't speak immediately, as if weighing her words carefully, but the silence between them was comfortable, familiar. She was no longer afraid of it. She wasn't afraid of him either, not in the way she had been when they first met. The uncertainty had faded, replaced by something softer, something that felt like acceptance, like trust. But still, a part of her remained guarded, hesitant to fully step into the warmth that was waiting just beyond the walls she had built around her heart. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly, her gaze shifting to the sky, where the last light of day was fading into the night. "It's peaceful out here, isn't it? I don't think I've ever really had a place like this before. Somewhere I could just breathe." Theodore nodded, moving closer to her. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood beside her, his presence filling the space between them in a way that was both comforting and electrifying. "It's been hard, hasn't it?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Ebony turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze, her eyes wide but open, vulnerable. "It has," she said simply, and for a moment there was a sadness in her eyes, a rawness that Theodore hadn't seen before. "But I'm getting there, little by little." He took a step closer, his heart beating a little faster as he saw the distance between them narrowing. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too, and with each passing day it seemed as though they were inching towards something neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. He reached out, his hand brushing gently against hers, a tentative gesture that spoke volumes. Ebony's breath caught, and for a split second neither of them moved. But then, as if something unspoken passed between them, she let her hand rest in his, the touch warm and electric, like a spark igniting something inside both of them. "Theodore," she began, her voice shaky but steady, "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I'm ready for us. After everything that's happened, after all the pain, I don't know how to trust again." He squeezed her hand gently, his voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to rush, Ebony. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking you to jump in and forget everything you've been through. I'm asking you to let me be here with you, to let me help you carry the weight of it all." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just the man who had helped her in her darkest hours, but the man who was standing before her, vulnerable in his own right, offering her something she had never been given, the chance to heal, the chance to love again. Her breath hitched as she realized that he wasn't just offering her a future. He was offering her a present, a moment where they could share something real, something beautiful, despite all the scars they carried. "I've been afraid," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "afraid that I'd let someone in again, only to have it all fall apart. But with you, I feel like maybe it's possible to let go of that fear." Theodore's heart swelled at her words, and in that moment, he knew that they were no longer just two people bound by their pasts. They were two people, standing on the edge of something new, something powerful. He didn't say anything more. Instead, he leaned down slowly, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was tender at first, but deepened with the force of everything they had been through together. It was a kiss of promise, of understanding, and of hope. A kiss that marked the beginning of something they had both longed for, but had been too afraid to reach for. As they pulled away, their foreheads resting together, neither of them spoke. There was nothing more to say, nothing that needed to be said. They had crossed a threshold, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Ebony felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Love. Real, honest love. Blossoming like the flowers around them, fragile but undeniable. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft, golden hue over the sprawling estate, but Theodore could barely see the beauty of the moment. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts of the upcoming battle he knew was coming. Raymond had returned, and with him, the threat of losing the children. The papers had already been filed. Raymond was seeking full custody, claiming that Ebony was unstable, unfit to be a mother. The accusations were as false as they were damaging, and Theodore was determined to fight them with everything he had. But there was a quiet fear in the pit of his stomach. Ebony had fought so hard for her children, and the thought of her losing them again was unbearable. He glanced over at her, standing at the window, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass. She had always been a fighter, but the weariness in her eyes, the uncertainty that had crept into her soul, was evident. Theodore knew that the fear of losing her children was a demon she could never quite shake, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much healing they had both experienced. This was not just a legal battle, it was a fight for her sense of worth, for her place in the world. And in a way, it was a fight for their future. Ebony had barely spoken since Raymond's return, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had always been proud, independent, and the thought of having to rely on anyone else, even Theodore, made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, to being seen as someone who needed saving. But what Raymond was doing, the way he was trying to tear apart her family, left her feeling helpless in a way she hadn't experienced since Marcus had died. She had been so strong for so long, but this battle felt different. It felt too big, too out of control. Ebony, Theodore's voice broke the silence, low and steady. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze, but there was an unspoken distance between them, a wall that had been put up without either of them realizing it. "We're not going to let him win. I promise you that." She shook her head, the frustration evident in her expression, but her voice was soft. "I don't know how to fight this, Theodore. I've been trying to protect my children, to keep them safe, but every time I think I've got a handle on it, something else happens. I'm scared I'll lose them forever. I can't bear that." The words hung in the air between them, raw and painful, but Theodore didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're not alone in this. I'll help you every step of the way. We'll fight together, and we'll win. You're stronger than you think, Ebony, and so are they." The last sentence was a quiet reminder of what was at stake, of the small, vulnerable lives that were entwined with their own. The babies were asleep in their room, unaware of the storm raging around them, but they were the reason they were both fighting. Theodore knew this battle wasn't just for Ebony, it was for them too. And no matter how difficult it was, he would not let Raymond tear apart the family they had built. A few days later, the courtroom was a place of cold, impersonal justice. Raymond sat on one side, his smug expression unwavering, while Ebony sat beside Theodore, her face pale but resolute. Her hand trembled slightly in his, but he didn't let go, offering her the quiet strength she needed. The lawyer he had hired was sharp, skilled in the art of defense, and Theodore knew they had a solid case. But still, there was a part of him that couldn't stop thinking about the stakes. The stakes for Ebony, for her children, and for the future they had begun to build together. As the proceedings began, Raymond's lawyer stood and made his case, painting a picture of a woman who was unfit to care for her children. The accusations were designed to wound, to break her down, but they were hollow based on lies and assumptions. Theodore's lawyer responded with cold, hard facts. Ebony's progress in regaining her strength, her stability, her unwavering love for her children, and the fact that, since moving into the house, the children had flourished under her care. But it was still a fight. It was still a battle. and it felt like every word from Raymond's side was a blow to the heart. Through it all, Ebony remained silent, her gaze focused ahead, her jaw clenched with determination. She wasn't going to break. Not now. Not when everything she had fought for was at risk. And Theodore couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for her. Despite everything, despite her doubts, despite her fears, she was standing strong. Finally, it was Ebony's turn. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured, everything she had fought for. She spoke not just for herself, but for her children, for the future she wanted to create, a future worth fighting for. "I fought for my children every day since the moment I knew I was pregnant," she said, her voice steady now, her eyes never leaving the judge. "I've lost so much, but I've never stopped loving them. I've never stopped being their mother, and I will do whatever it takes to ensure they grow up in a place where they feel safe and know they are loved. I don't need anyone to tell me I'm unfit to be their mother. I've proved that every single day." Her words hung in the air, powerful and unwavering, and for a moment there was a quiet in the room, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting. Theodore could see the judge's gaze softening, the lines on his face shifting as he took in what Ebony had said. He could feel the shift, the change in the room, as if the tide were turning. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. "The court finds in favor of the mother. Raymond Brooks' petition for custody is denied." Ebony's breath caught in her throat, and for the briefest of moments she was frozen, unable to believe the words. But when she turned to Theodore, she saw the same relief mirrored in his eyes, and a wave of emotion washed over her. She didn't need to say anything. The look they shared spoke volumes. They had won. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Theodore turned to Ebony, his hand resting gently on hers. "We did it," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. "You did it." Ebony smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "We did it," she whispered, "together." And in that moment, she knew that the future they were building wasn't just a dream, it was real. It was a future filled with hope, with love, and with the possibility of something greater. Something they had built together, and it was only just beginning. Thank you for taking the time to experience this journey with us. We hope you found inspiration and meaning in Ebony and Theodore's story of resilience, love, and the power of starting anew. We would love to hear your thoughts and reflections on the story. Feel free to leave a comment below and share your perspective. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories. We appreciate your support and look forward to connecting with you again soon.